Sing a new church into being. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is arguably the holiest site for Christians, there is a ladder on a ledge, leaning up against a wall, above the main entrance. And this ladder is called the Immovable Ladder, and it has a curious history. This ladder has been in the same spot for approximately 300 years, maybe longer. An engraving of the church made in 1728 by a Franciscan priest named Elzarius Horn. This engraving shows the ladder in that exact spot. As early as 1757, this ladder is mentioned in writings. Beginning in the mid-1850s, this ladder shows up in photographs and has been revealed in every photograph taken of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre since. Now, why has no one moved this ladder for 300 years? Well, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has a fascinating history. It's built on what is believed to be Golgotha, the place where Yeshua was crucified. Now, many of the sites in Israel are approximations or best guesses or based on folklore. In fact, many of the places I visited in Israel, you know in your mind that this isn't actually where Yeshua fed, the 5,000 people or whatever. You know it's probably somewhere within 10 miles, but it's not exactly here. But what's interesting is most archaeologists and scholars agree that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is most likely where Golgotha was. I found that very interesting when I visited this site. Now, the original church was completed in 335 by the Emperor Constantine under the direction of his mother, Helena. And originally it was actually two buildings. One small chapel was built atop where Yeshua was buried, his tomb. And another larger chapel was built over Golgotha, where Yeshua was crucified. Now, today the church is much, much bigger, and both sites are contained in this large church complex. But the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in its original form, it's almost 1,700 years old. But it's been destroyed and rebuilt a number of times. Anyone who is familiar with the history of the Middle East knows there's been a lot of action that has happened there. In fact, in the 11th century, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was almost completely destroyed by the Muslims when they overtook Jerusalem and took control. In fact, that was one of the primary instigations of the now infamous Crusades. The Christians wanted to come and rebuild the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and protect this holy site. Now, today, the church complex is massive, and it is comprised of many different chapels and rooms that are owned and operated by several different Christian denominations. In fact, there are 6 denominations that currently share this building. There are the Roman Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, and the Armenian Orthodox. Those 3 denominations have the most power and influence. And then there's the Syriac Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox, and the Ethiopian Orthodox churches. They also have sections within this large church complex. And then in addition to these sectarian spaces, there is shared space. Now, those of us who have history with Avon, we are very familiar with shared space and all the complications that can arise from having shared space.
Oh, yes.
Now, we only shared space with one other organization. Can you imagine sharing space with 5 other different organizations, completely different denominations? As you can probably imagine, there have been some issues. There have been constant power struggles for position and control in this church. So much so that in 1757, the Ottoman Sultan, Osman III, who controlled Jerusalem at the time, he issued a ruling that codified the current power structures and relations existing within this church at the time. And it was called the status quo. And this was reaffirmed in 1852, and then it was elevated to become an instrument of international law that's still in force today. This status quo means that everything that happens in the church, from renovations to the timing of services, to who picks up the trash, to when and who lights the candles, everything is all governed by a strict set of rules that all 6 denominations have agreed upon. In fact, there's a strict set of rules for how and who opens the church doors every morning and evening. And I was surprised to learn that it's 2 Muslim families that have been given the key. And they are in charge of opening the church doors in the morning and closing them in the evening. The first Muslim family was given the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the 7th century, and then it became a fairly taxing ordeal, so they added another family in the 15th century. And what was interesting, you can imagine how old this key is. The new key for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is over 500 years old. All that to say, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the most complicated buildings in the world as far as operations and upkeep are concerned. Okay, now with all that background, why has this ladder been in the same spot for approximately 300 years? Well, it's unclear which denomination owns the ladder. Nobody knows why the ladder was put there, when it was placed there, and most importantly, who put it there. And because they don't know which denomination owns the ladder, no denomination is permitted, according to the status quo, to move it. So there it has stood. Only about 6 feet high, this ladder. But there it stands on the ledge, unmoved, for 300 years, with a few exceptions. In 1997, a tourist identified only as Andy, we assume he was American. Forgive me, I love you, my American friends. He snuck around the church, found the right window, and took the ladder in and hid it. Well, after a few weeks, they found it, and church authorities put it back to its original position. Well, then again, in 2009, some prankster moved the ladder about 10 feet along the ledge. Well, it didn't take long for the church authorities to notice this and move it and put it back in its original spot. Now, if you are thinking it's ridiculous and kind of hilarious that the church authorities could agree to move the ladder back to its original position, but cannot agree to just move it and put it away in storage, you would not be alone. I find this story humorous, but I also find it fascinating for many reasons. For one, I think it contains a metaphor that applies to all churches. Not just churches, all groups and organizations. I mean, most churches have their immovable ladders, metaphorically speaking, right? There are things we just don't touch as a church, issues we don't address, things we cannot or will not move or change. Why? Because we can't or we won't agree on it. So we don't even go there. And I was thinking, and I came up with a few immovable ladders that Avon has. I'm not going to share them with you. I don't see any fruit to be gained from that. I'm prepared. I'm prepared to resist all temptations. Because the truth is, we don't even want to talk about these immovable ladders, let alone touch them. But here's the thing. We also have immovable ladders in our individual personal lives as well. There are things in your life that you've been putting off dealing with for years or decades. Things you know you need to deal with, but you've just ignored. And over time, they just became part of the status quo of who you are. You know, there are certain fears, limiting beliefs, habits, patterns of behavior that have been with you for as long as you can remember. And once in a while, you notice them and you think, oh man, I really need to deal with that or work on that. But every time you have that thought, it's the same as every other time you've had that thought in the past. Nothing changes, nothing happens. The status quo in your life is maintained, keeping your immovable ladder right where it's always been. Why? Because our inner beings are kind of like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in that there are competing interests and different parts within us. There are a number of different psychological systems that describe in their own unique way these different parts within us. Like Freud, what were the parts that he liked to talk about? The ego, the id, the superego. Jung had different terminology to talk about the different parts within us. He talked about the persona and the shadow, the anime, animus, the subconscious, the archetypes within us. About a year ago, I talked about internal family systems, and that's a different psychological system that talks about the different parts within us as if they are members of a family, hence the name internal family systems. Many, many different psychological systems with different terminology to talk about the different parts within our inner beings. But Here's the thing they all have in common. They all identify there are different parts within us, and they are often in conflict with one another. Well, one thing I have learned over time, as I have followed the way of Jesus, as I have studied the Bible, have studied the lives of other people who have followed the way of Jesus, here's something that I have learned. When all your internal parts align and agree on something, this unleashes tremendous power in our lives. When your entire inner being says, yes, we are going to do this, like every part of you, it's amazing what you can get done. I mean, have you ever experienced that where you are surprised at what you were capable of? I hope all of you have had at least a glimpse of that, a moment where you're, wow, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I was capable of that. It's like you kicked into a higher gear you didn't know you have. Someone testify. Has someone had this moment? Shane. All right, I see a few hands. I like saying that. It takes me back to my past. I see that hand. There is a saying. I'm sure you've heard it. The saying is this: when the stars align. Have you heard that saying? Yep. When the stars align. And what that saying is referring to is this reality that conditions need to be completely right for certain things to happen. Yep. Certain things can only happen when the stars align. And this describes our inner reality as well. When your internal stars align, when everything within you, every part within you comes into one accord, comes into agreement, aligns, and says, yes, now is the time. You unleash a power in your life that is almost magical. And when this alignment within you is in alignment with God's desires, God's intentions, God's will, you become an unstoppable force. And that's when it becomes possible to move the immovable ladders in our lives. And I think it's only then. And the same is true for us as a community. When we come into one accord, when we come into alignment with one another, when we agree on a focus and a common goal, and when that common focus and common goal is in alignment with God's desires, we become an unstoppable force. Yeshua talks about this unstoppable power. And he calls it faith. That's the name that he gives us. In Mark chapter 9, verse 23, Yeshua says, all things are possible for those who have faith. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Yeshua says, all things are possible with God. All things. It's a very bold claim that Yeshua is making. So many Christians, we just read the stuff, amen, yes, I believe it. Do you? All things are possible with God. All things are possible to those who have faith. Do you really believe that? I don't know if I do most of the time. I just read past it, I'm like, oh, Yeshua, you and your hyperbole. You do get carried away, Yeshua, when you get preaching. I know the feeling. Matthew 17, Yeshua says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, just a little bit of faith, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. And nothing will be impossible to you. Nothing. When we have faith, even a bit of faith, Yeshua says, it's so powerful in our lives. So powerful that we can move those immovable ladders. We can move mountains. Is there something worth contemplating there, or should we just move on and leave Yeshua to his hyperbolic ranting? Paul, the Apostle Paul, actually believed Yeshua. Now we know he was a fanatic, though.
Can we really trust him? In Ephesians 3:20, he says, now with Christ, who is able to do immeasurably more than anything we could ask or that we could even imagine. I don't know how your imaginations work, but I have a very vivid, active imagination. And to think that Christ, who is able to do immeasurably more than I can imagine, that's a lot. According to his power that is at work within us. The power of Christ is at work within us. And the power of faith is the power of Christ, the divine power unleashed in our lives. Now, what does it mean to have faith? Well, for many of us, faith and belief are the same thing. They're synonymous, right? But they're very different. We believe with our minds. Like, to believe is to mentally agree that something is true. You know, we take a statement. God exists. I believe God exists. I mentally agree that that statement is true. But faith is not the same as belief. Faith is not mentally agreeing that something is true. Faith is a power we tap into. Very different. Very different. It involves more than our minds. Faith only happens when our inner beings align. Faith involves our emotions, our passions, our will, our determination, our body. We feel it in our bones. We feel it in our gut. Amen. Faith is the aligning of our internal stars that gives us access to the very power of God that makes anything possible. Now, many of you have probably heard this story. I mean, it is the classic sermon illustration. After I share it, I'll ask you to raise your hand if you've heard this. I mean, if you've been going to church, especially if you were back in church in the 80s and 90s, I would put money that you have heard this. But I'm going to share it because it's a fun story. In 1859, a French acrobat named Charles Blondin. Is anyone already? Yeah, people, okay, I see nodding heads. Right on. Charles Blondin made history. He was the first person to walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. In the summer of 1859, he crossed over many times, and he did amazing things on that tightrope. No harness, no safety gear. He did somersaults. He rode a bike across there. He took a big camera. I don't know if you know what cameras were like in 1859, but they were big, and they had to explode in order to take a photo. It was pretty crazy. He took that out to the middle, and he took a photo from halfway across Niagara Falls on this little rope. He crossed on stilts. He rode a bike across. He did all sorts of things, much to the delight of crowds on both sides of Niagara Falls, the Canadian side and the American side. After crossing dozens of times, he pushed a wheelbarrow across. And when he arrived at the side, he said, "How many of you believe I can cross back with this wheelbarrow with someone inside of it?" And everyone said, "Of course." They started, "Yeah, yes, of course we believe you can do it." He said, "That's wonderful. Who will volunteer to go in the wheelbarrow?" And of course, no one did. Now, common sense would dictate that you wouldn't. This sermon illustration and analogy has limitations. You know, there's such a thing as risk-reward analysis, right? And risk-reward analysis would be like, yeah, it just takes one mistake. You know, Charles, you've been very successful, but it just takes one mistake and we're both gone. So I think that was a good decision that people did not get in the wheelbarrow, but it does illustrate the difference between faith and belief. When Charles Blondin asked people, do you believe that I can get across? Everyone said yes. And you know what? I think they were sincere. I think they actually believed it. Of course you can. Yes, my mind agrees with the statement that you can push someone across in a wheelbarrow. You've crossed doing so many things. Of course we believe this. But faith is getting in the wheelbarrow. Faith is when we are all in. Faith is when not just our mind, but our heart, our body, our soul, our entire beings are invested. And it's only with this faith, and faith is a risk. What's the most common phrase that has the word faith in it? Leap of faith, which was coined by my favorite philosopher, Soren Kierkegaard. Leap of faith. There is a risk that comes with faith. There's a risk when you step out of a boat and try to walk on water. There's a risk that comes with faith, but it's only with faith where the magic happens, where we tap into the very power of God. And it's only with faith, Yeshua says, that the impossible becomes possible. It's only with faith, the alignment of all the parts within us, that the immovable ladders, the immovable mountains in our lives can be moved. So I have two questions for you for the discussion circles. First question is this: has this happened? Can you recall a time in your life where you really did take a leap of faith? You were all in, and you felt the very power of God flowing through your life. Has that ever happened? And I kind of think of it this way: there's all these different parts of us that are kind of like parts of a conduit. And when they all kind of just line up in the center, all line up, then all of a sudden the power of God can flow into us and through us. Have you ever had a moment like that? That's the first question. Second, how did it happen? How did you enter into faith fully? How did you tap into the power of God by faith? All right, those two questions. Before we break up into discussion circles, though, I'm going to ask Mary Ann and the rest of the band to come and lead us in another song.